I guess we should start with the House of Lords last night, and 7 defeats for the government, some quite big majorities compared to expectations. Ken Clarke, the former Tory Lord Chancellor, making a speech criticising the legislation. The government now says that they won't bring this back into Parliament next week, so it will be happening again in April, postpones potential planes to Rwanda until June. How much of a problem is this for the government, or is this fight helpful to them?
I don't know. I'm not sure it's helpful. I'm not sure it's a surprise either. I think they were expecting this. I mean, the unelected boobies of the House of Lords were never going to be keen on this. It's no surprise either that Kenneth Clarke was opposing it. He has been opposing it the whole way through. And the establishment is desperate to stop this, or to delay it as long as possible, to prevent there being an electoral bounce from it. For the Conservatives. That seems to me what's going on. The benefit of this for...
The establishment wants to stop an electoral bounce?
Yeah, they're trying to stop the Tories getting any sort of benefit from this.
The establishment?
The Tory establishment.
That's kind of interesting. Interesting language, establishment.
You perhaps haven't been to the House of Lords.
With a majority of Conservatives in it.
Well, the House of Lords, a lot of the Tory peers are not particularly right-wing. And there is a sense, I think, that the civil service, the lawyers, the whole apparat of Whitehall is very anti this Rwanda bill.
Well, because they're quite in favour of the rule of law, probably.
No, I think it's also...
amendments in the House of Lords to suggest that it might be a good thing if we stuck by the law.
I think there's I disagree with you. I think there's a big sense of inertia. And it's a bit tricky discussing this with Ed presenting the programme, given that his wife is the Shadow Home Secretary. But...
What's tricky about that, Quentin?
Completely possible.
Well, I just think it is... it's tricky if you're trying to have a debate with someone and...
well, you've just told me about something you disagree with your wife strongly about. You don't have the same views as your spouse always.
Okay, I wasn't debating, I was asking you a question.
What do you mean?
I was asking you questions.
Well,
Are you accusing Ed of being part of the anti-Tory establishment now?
Yeah, I sure would. I certainly would. Now, come on, I think there's no doubt that the establishment is very against this bill.
But that doesn't necessarily mean they're against it.
I think it's peculiar if you're suggesting otherwise.
Well,
they would argue they're against it because they say that it's wrong. And they're allowed to have that opinion. They would also argue that one of the amendments that they voted on was that they wanted to consider different rules of law. That was the case, wasn't it? And so, therefore, isn't that the point of the House of Lords, to challenge that?
Well, the House of Lords is there as a revising chamber, yes. But it's not there, I would argue, as a complete blockage in the works. And that seems to be what's going on at the moment.
But it's perfectly reasonable for something that engages with the sorts of things that people in the House of Lords are going to be concerned about, human rights, the rule of law, for them to have 2 goes round, because this is only the second time round in the House of Lords. The government whipped, it's quite hard to whip in the House of Lords, but they whipped very hard. Lots of Conservative peers turned up, and yet they still managed to lose on 7 different government amendments. It's now going to come back to the House of Commons. That's completely legitimate part of the establishment going on there. In actual fact, if the government were that worried about it, they could have brought those amendments back to the House of Commons at the beginning of next week when the Commons is still sitting. They chose not to. They want it to go until after
And why
Easter.
do you think that is, Jackie? Because, the heart of this, of course, I think nobody on any side and any politics wants people to be risking their lives crossing the channel. Okay. And looking at some of the stats, numbers were down in January on the year before, numbers were down in February on the year before. Yesterday, they rose sharply, March compared with March in 23, 1,274 were the numbers for March. So the problem isn't going away, is it? So why would the government not address it again? Is it because they think it'll fail again? They'll have an issue with the votes next week? Why wait till June?
Well, I don't think they'll have a problem with the votes in the House of Commons. It would be very surprising if they did, because they've got a good majority. Right. I think it comes back to the sort of implication of Ed's first question, which was, yes, there is a very serious problem here, but I don't think this legislation is about solving that problem. I think this legislation is about deciding who you want to blame, giving people like Quentin the opportunity to call everybody apart from the government the establishment and to have a go at them, and using it as an electoral dividing line with Labour in the run-up to a general election. If you really wanted to solve the problem, what you'd be doing is cutting the thing that is a definite draw, and that is, if you get to this country, it will take the Home Office forever to decide whether or not you've got a legitimate right to remain or not. That's what people should be focusing on, as well as, you know, much better law enforcement to stop the gangs in the first place. This is all about the politics.
Do you agree, Quentin?
It's not about the problem.
No, I think this policy would be a good deterrent. And I think the fact that it's now been delayed again, I think the result of that, there'll be more people coming over on the boats and more people dying in the Channel. I don't want that to happen. But the judiciary seems pretty laid back about that.
But the question is, will there be a bounce in the polls if a plane goes in June?
The longer,
know now that
no, I'm not
25% of people support this, so majority don't think it's a good policy at the moment, according to the opinion polls, and you know, those are people of Labour and Conservative voting hue. If you get to June and you have a flight goes with 150 people, you know, per person, very expensive, and you've still got thousands of people coming over over the summer in the boats, does that work for the government? Unless, as you say, one flight with 150 people suddenly deters tens of thousands of people in July and August. I mean, that is at least a gamble, isn't it, politically?
Well, Mr. Cooper, I would say that the closer you get to the election, the less there will be an electoral bounce.
Why do you keep saying that?
Because I just think
isn't that really
I don't want to make a big thing of it.
Well, you are making a big thing of it. You've made a thing of it twice. It's really patronising to me and to the idea. Of course, it is. The idea that I can't ask you questions on this television programme because I'm married to somebody who has a role in politics.
Shadow Home Secretary.
Yes. Well, listen,
it's a bit peculiar.
In my experience, people who make those kind of taunts are people who find it hard to answer the questions. Why don't you answer the question and stop playing silly politics?
I was trying to answer the question.
No, you weren't.
I was trying to answer the question.
You were not making slurs. You were using the kind of House of Commons poor political devices, which people do if they can't answer the question. Answer the question.
Edward, I am not a politician. I don't support
you sound like a politician.
I don't support any political party.
You sound like a politician to me. The establishment, the wife of Mr. Cooper. These are the kind of political games people play. You report on them when you write sketches. It feels like you've become infected by it.
I was trying to say to you, I think the Tories will not get a benefit from this.
OK, that's a good answer.
But you wouldn't let me.
No, I didn't. I interrupted you when you called me Mr. Cooper and made a slur on my integrity rather than answering the questions. Answer the questions and don't slander me.
I think it's a legitimate slur. We talk about Rishi Sunak and we journos, will have a go at him because of his wife.
Well, let's talk about Rishi Sunak.
Have a go at him because of his wife?
Yeah,
the question for Rishi Sunak is inflation coming down? Is he managing the borders well? Are waiting times coming down? Is he leading the country well? If you want to have a go at his wife, you do that. But that just seems to be small-minded and petty politics. Get on the big issues, Quentin.
Can I ask you about Rishi Sunak having apparently a rapturous and loud response at the 1922 committee about ventures, at the same time as we hear that Robert Jenrick is putting his name forward for a leadership battle, which might have dampened that applause for him a little bit, or maybe not, Quentin?
Yeah, you never really believe the applause at a 1922 committee because it's not applause, actually. They hit the desk.
Yeah.
But it amounts to nothing because it's for show, because they know that the hacks are in the corridor outside and timing the amount of desk thumping. So I wouldn't put too much store by that. But Sunak yesterday was extraordinarily upbeat in the House of Commons. It was very peculiar because he's 20 points behind in the opinion polls. And yet, if you'd looked at him and Keir Starmer, Sir Keir looked like the misery guts, and Sunak looked like he'd been on, the full-strength Coke again. And perhaps
Coca-Cola.
Perhaps they know something about the interest rates announcement. I wouldn't have thought they do, actually. But the inflation figures seem to have keyed them up, or else they've taken the decision. We've got to be a bit more cheerful.
Yeah, but it's that, isn't it? I mean, he had a tough weekend. Everybody on the Conservative benches seems at some point or another to have been suggested as a potential, I mean, the stalking horse isn't possible anymore, but as a potential new leader of the Conservative Party. He had to get up, because otherwise his leadership was sort of disappearing into a morass of
quite difficult to
depression.
do it, though. Do you remember Mrs. May, when she was trailing in the opinion polls, PMQs used to like going to a morgue in those days, and also Gordon, towards the end of his time, it wasn't entirely rip-snortingly cheerful. So to do that as a performer, and I don't think Sunak's a particularly good actor.
No.
I think he's actually quite a sort of sunny personality. But to see him also, he had Penny Mordaunt too along from him. They didn't want her sitting right next to him.
But is it you talked about, you know, the Tories sort of circling the wagons almost in the 1922 committee. Is it true, what I read, that there is a certain amount of sort of crossness from older Tories about the fact that they think some of those elected in 2019 are getting a bit carried away with their opposition to Rishi Sunak, and actually those people who are old hands know that if you've had 5 prime ministers in as many years or whatever it is, you're not now going to want to change the leadership of the Conservative Party.
I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, because the longer that people have been in Parliament, the more sort of
part of the establishment,
the more arrogant they become, and the more snooty. But if you're an elected MP, I'd say you're the same. You know, if you one MP to me has the same democratic value as another.
Do you think they should get rid of Rishi then?
No, I think it's far too late.
And if you're Rishi Sunak, is it better to have your MPs in Parliament, or is it better to send them away off to their constituencies? Because my experience in politics, because I was a politician, as you know, Quentin, for a few years until 2015. That actually, if people go back to their constituencies and start talking to their families and to the voters and to party members, that can sometimes be destabilising. So, you know, what do you think people will hear when they go back to their constituencies?
I think there's a value to having them in both places, because if you got them in the Commons, you can keep them busy with votes, which stops them plotting sometimes.
And the whips can talk to them.
But also
recesses are a bit risky.
But they're about to have an Easter recess. They'll go into the constituencies and they hear what the voters are saying. That's important.
They will, because of course what they'll also be doing over their Easter holidays is knocking on some doors in support of their local councillors and mayors in quite a few places in the country. Yeah. And they'll begin to hear what's going to happen on May the 2nd. And I think what Rishi Sunak and those around him might be worried about is that that's going to be a pretty bad day, those local elections, for the Tories. And then the question is whether or not it's bad enough to actually decide that it isn't too late to replace him.